to the Simply His coffee shop. I am so excited for today because we have some exciting news. Rescue Us is finally released. We are so excited about this. We have showed you guys and talked about this before on how excited we are for this and how long it's been in production. But today we finally have copies, and you can buy yourself a copy and buy some for your friends as well. And so today we have special guests to talk about it again. We have Joe Horn.
Hey, you can also stream it.
You can also stream it,
Go to
yes.
skywatchtv.com/stream. It took me a second. But yes, you can stream it right away and not pay shipping.
That's a great thing. And then we also have Brittney Jackson.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so we're very excited about talking about this. But before we do, we want to show you the trailer. So watch this.
There is an all-out war being waged on the minds of an entire generation of today's young people.
State lawmakers are now questioning how 70 foster kids can go missing.
They have convinced us in the West that children are a burden. Birth rates are below replacement levels just about everywhere in the Northern Hemisphere.
People would have to be utterly blind or insane not to recognize the current heartbreaking onslaught against our most vulnerable citizens, our children.
Children who have been thrown up against walls and locked in closets. Children who hide under their beds in fear and whose nightmares are real. Children who have been beaten with 2x4s, whipped with bicycle chains, and burned with cigarette butts.
Children living in foster care are 4 to 5 times more likely to commit suicide than those who are not.
An agenda to submit our current generation of children to a fate far worse than death is being carried out.
I was 5 years old. I was doing dishes. My mom was so mad. She had picked up one of the steak knives and shoved it through my hand and just walked away.
Who will stand in the gap for these children? These are real lives.
This is such a powerful docuseries, and you really, truly do not want to miss it. We've been doing a lot of social media on it, and we've been talking about it kind of nonstop, but it's been very much something that's so dear to our hearts, and it's just a powerful, and it's a very much needed series. So please get yourself a copy. But we thought this would be a really fun one since we are a little bit more relaxed on Simply His. We thought we could talk to both Joe and Brittney more about what went into making this and what were some of the issues, because I know we've mentioned before too that a lot of things went wrong with this series and how they had to do all kinds of different things. But Brittney, we'll start with you. How was it for you to kind of come into the middle of a project and have to take over and go through like, okay, well, 1 and 2 and 3, episodes 1, 2, and 3 are basically done, but you might have had to go back in and tweak a little bit. But then I know you really poured yourself into episode 4. Tell us a little bit about what that was and how that affected everything.
Yeah, so coming into the series, kind of not really the middle just because of how long it took us. It was kind of like still the beginning, but a little closer to the middle.
If I had to put a number on it, I would say in all reality, it was probably about 27% done.
Yeah.
So not even halfway.
Joe was like trying to figure out who's going to finish Rescue Us. And I kind of naively volunteered myself, like, sure, that should be easy.
And I'm so glad you didn't know what you were getting into.
Right. And, I had been working at the studio for like about a year and, editing episodes like Simply His, some Skywatch things. Right. And so I kind of had a little bit
Of an idea.
Yeah, I cut like some ads for Simply His. That was like my bigger projects, putting music. And I volunteered to help with Rescue Us. And episode 4 was a really daunting one to come into for your first time making a documentary. It in and of itself was a documentary.
It is.
Yes,
it absolutely is.
And I'm really grateful that's the one I got to be a part of, though, for the first one, because then it was almost like tackle the hardest part first, and then the rest of it wasn't too bad. The first thing that Joe and I did was plan out the montage that plays at the beginning of celebrating Tom's life, and this was before he passed away.
Right.
So what we were calling it was the Heroes Montage. This is going to be showing his whole career up to that point, being on Skywatch, Raiders News Update, being on the news everywhere. That was like one of the hardest parts of that episode was, scouring the internet, trying to find these clips. And Joe and I were finding clips that he hadn't even heard of or seen. He's like, I didn't know my dad was on that show. Or when did he do that?
No, I know. There's a massive vault of stuff of him that floats around that, my mom and I couldn't keep up. It was 20 years of him traveling constantly to be on television or radio or whatever. And for context, if you're watching this and you don't know, episode 4 is where the series turns from identifying the dilemma that the children of our nation in particular are facing in terms of becoming missing at the border or abused in and outside of systems like foster care. And now episode 4 starts to show you the introduction to the founders of Skywatch TV's charitable ministry, Whispering Ponies Ranch.
Right.
We thought before we show you what is being done at Whispering Ponies Ranch, let's introduce you to the founders.
And why they did it.
So we decided to take on kind of a true E-Hollywood approach to storytelling with my father, Dr. Thomas Horn, who you're talking about in the Heroes Montage, and then, of course, my mother, who's here today, Juanita Horn, as co-founders of Whispering Ponies Ranch, starting you off at childhood.
Right.
And building this, this reconstruction of them as children, then they finally meet. Now they're dating, what it was like to be young pastors, and then eventually how God brought them to the work that's being done at Whispering Ponies Ranch today. So, no big deal. You go from cutting TV to telling that level.
No pressure.
But here's the thing.
At all.
Here's the thing, because this also wasn't my first documentary film. Brittney was killing herself, blowing her emotional wad on this episode. I'm grateful that was her first one too, because it took a lot out of her. And if you were going to blow one giant wad emotionally on an episode, that was the one to start with.
Right.
And episodes 5 and 6 were almost kind of like buttoning the series up.
Yeah.
And so you're getting closer to the end. But yeah, I had no idea either when the series was almost in jeopardy of not being finished, that you would have the chops. Because, cutting television on paper, Brittney had not, completed this long checklist of documentary film projects or anything we could even look at. It was just, here we are, Lord, we really want to finish this series. I would love to take a bunch of credit for having micromanaged every little frame. I did a lot of supportive work, but I will give tons of credit to Brittney for having a lot of it.
Thank you.
Intellectually finished. And here's the thing. I don't know that she'll ever do another documentary because of the toll this series took on her. But if this was your magnum opus, if this was your one hill to take, I think what God's going to do with this series is pretty spectacular.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this episode was really special, and I actually worked a lot with Nita as well. Nita was getting texts and emails from me all the time asking for very specific, hey, do you have a picture of this moment? And she's like, let me look. And there's actually a fun day where my husband Dakota and I went to her house, and she had 8 of these huge picture boxes, and we're all just going through tons and tons of pictures, and I was finding some real nuggets in there that she had even forgot existed. And she's like, you know what, why don't you just take these boxes so that I just have this collection, so whenever I find a moment that I am trying to storytell, I have this big collection. In the series, in episode 4, they talk about how Nita's house had burnt down.
Right.
And I believe it was 2010.
11. It was January of 11, yep.
And so a lot of the pictures had actually been damaged from that fire. And so my husband Dakota and I had to scan them, kind of lay them on with like a bunch of heavy books to get them as flat as possible.
Yeah.
And then he actually took them into Photoshop and cleaned up a lot of them so that it was a full picture, not just little burnt pieces.
Right.
And that was a cool way to try to make them work. And then in the series, there's also a montage where we showed a bunch of pictures that were damaged beyond repair, just as an example of everything that had been lost in that fire. And that were really good pictures that I would have liked to use, but just wasn't able to. Yeah, episode 4. It's hard to pick your favorite, you know, like that people say when you have kids, you don't want to pick favorites, but 4, I think, is my favorite and holds a special place in my heart just because of the story it tells.
Right. I agree. And I thought it was a really cool thing, though, too, that since you are family, that you got to kind of dive in even deeper. And with you wanting to be a historian and things like that, it's kind of a cool little ancestry type thing where you were able to, you're married into the family, but then you got to dive into the great grandmas and grandpas and uncles and things like that. So I thought that was a really cool way for you to kind of dive in on some of that too.
Yeah, learning about my husband's family, his ancestors, where he came from.
Right.
We actually found a really old news article from the 30s about how the great-grandparents had come here from the Dust Bowl, moved to Arizona. Yeah, and so that was cool to read the real story from the 30s and see the little picture of them traveling here. And, you know, in the 30s with the Dust Bowl, there was like huge caravans, but for some reason they interviewed them. So that was pretty cool to revisit that.
That's where I get my middle name.
Yeah.
Grandpa Artis McLaughlin, Joe Artis Horn.
Yep.
He is where I get my middle name.
Right.
So what all went into episodes 5 and 6 then after you were done with the big daunting thing of getting all of the family in the story and weaving all of this stuff in? What went into 5 and 6?
So after 4 ends, you're kind of left with a cliffhanger of the idea of this ranch concept. And, you know, at the end of episode 4, we have a montage just kind of quickly showing what it's like to be at the ranch. But there's not a lot of context because we're trying to show you what's to come.
It's a segue,
Yeah.
To Whispering Ponies Ranch.
To Whispering Ponies Ranch. And so episode 5 starts, and now it's shifted gears to focus on what is Whispering Ponies Ranch and how did it even become a thing from, you know, you hear about Tom and Nita's stories in episode 4. Okay, how did they take their stories and make it into what God had a plan for? Even from being 5 years old, you know, God plants these little seeds in their lives. And so episode 5, you actually get to shift gears as well and talk to Joe Horn and see how he is in this big picture. You talk about how you were at this camp in Oregon called Camp Davidson and we're training on zip lines and swimming pools, and you didn't know that that was going to kind of be what you do 20 years later at Whispering Ponies Ranch.
Yeah, a lot of stuff changed for us this year. We had to kind of redirect the way we did camp from Whispering Ponies Ranch to friends of ours now like Camp Eagle Rock. And was the first summer ever that we had, instead of just worked on facilitating at Whispering Ponies Ranch things like food service and the rock wall and the zip line, actually go and serve as counselors. And it was a lot to sign up for. And we did it over and over. My 2 oldest daughters did it several times. One of our favorite counselors who organizes a Royal Family Kids camp, Will Johnson, he told me a few weeks after summer ended, he said, you know, the emotional toll that our counselors experience just doing 1 week of being constantly with these troubled kids where there is no reprieve and you're with them literally from breakfast, noon, dinner, and then you do it again. And in the middle of the night, they're having nightmares and it's night terrors and little Susie wet the bed. And
they end up being with them for about 22 hours.
It's constant.
A day.
It's constant. They get like an hour at night where there will be a team come in and take over
Just
putting the children to bed initially, just to give the counselors like that 1 hour.
A minute to breathe.
But he said that the emotional toll of that is so extreme that it takes about 6 months for their volunteers after the summer to kind of raise their hands and say, "Okay, I'll do it again next year." They have to recover.
But their compassion
compels them to come back. Our sweet girls did this for weeks this summer, and
Straight almost.
they were just absolute
It was almost
warriors.
back to back.
It took
But we
the
made
toll.
we
They were
made some
feeling
of the
it.
most important memories, I think, in terms of my ministerial career ever this last summer with
Yeah.
Counselor Dale and
Yeah.
Big Steve, some of these kids we served.
For those who don't know, Counselor Dale is a young
He's
boy.
a young boy that
who
we-
tagged himself that name
Yeah.
as a projection of what he's going to do with his future, which came out of being at this particular
Yeah,
camp. And this is
yeah.
why I love it so much.
Yeah, it was first day of camp, and I saw this blonde little boy, and you could tell he had been to a Royal Family Kid camp before, because they're doing the songs, and he knows all the words.
Right.
Right.
So right away, I picked up on that, and of course, one of my things is I highlight everything I can think of to
Right.
make these kids feel affirmation and love and all
Right.
this.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know his name at the time, and I said, "Man, I could tell right away. You've been here before. You know these words, right?" And he kind of yeah, I know the word. I know the songs. And I said, "Maybe someday you'll be the one teaching these things. You could be a counselor." Do you mean that I could? You bet you could. All you got to do is stay with it, man. Grow up,
Goodness sakes.
turn around, and reach out to the Royal Family Kids and get placement. You can take all the lessons you've learned and turn it around, be a counselor. So then, of course, for the rest of the week, he's referring to himself now in third person as
Right.
Counselor Dale.
Right?
And there's this one memory I have. We were playing Nerf tag football or something like this, flag football.
Yeah.
If I didn't pay attention, man, I'd start talking to some of the other kids. I would hear this voice over here. Uncle Joe, Uncle Joe, Uncle Joe. I'd look over. Did you see what Counselor Dale just did? Still in third person.
I love
Not
it.
did you see what I did?
Oh, I love
Did you see what Counselor Dale just did?
Right?
Right. It's a projection.
Yeah, no, look,
So sweet.
these kids, we are taking for granted that maybe
Yeah.
some of the people watching this program or hearing it via podcast even know what we're talking about. But we're
Right.
talking about the charitable work that goes into these children that are either in foster care or have been saved from sex trafficking. When we serve them during these week-long camps where they get to learn about Jesus and be involved in a highly specialized rehabilitation program, and it is the heartbeat of this ministry.
Right.
So that's what does he talk, Counselor Dale? They're playing football. These are just examples, small excerpts of what happens at places like Whispering Ponies Ranch and, of course, now Camp Eagle Rock, wherever we're able to serve these kids. But
Well, and episode 5 does break down what it's like to be at Whispering Ponies Ranch, but kind of just Royal Family Kids camps in general.
In general, yeah.
And in episode 5, so throughout the whole Rescue Us series, you're hearing of this woman named Samantha Orr, and she's retelling her childhood.
Yeah.
She was one of the worst cases of child abuse in Missouri history, and
Right.
it's specifically in Springfield, Missouri. And so episodes 1, 2, and 3, she's telling this really hard story of her upbringing, everything
Right.
that happened to her. But then episode 5 is where everything takes a huge turn for her
Right.
life. At the end of episode 3, she kind of explains how she gets rescued out of her situation.
Right.
And she doesn't really know what's going to happen to her.
Right.
And in episode 5, you get to see her go to a Royal Family Kids camp. And we actually used Joe and Catherine's daughter, Rebecca, as the older Samantha Orr in this story to show her telling these really intimate moments that she had at camp.
Right.
Where
Yeah.
she had never had a birthday in her entire life. Her
Yep.
parents were so
Never
abusive to
celebrated
her.
And how old was she at that point?
I believe she was around 8.
Yeah.
So can you imagine? Seriously? These children are 8, 10, 11. We've seen it as old as 12, where they still are for the first time having a birthday recognition.
Yes.
And she talks about how anytime there was present giving in her house, her parents would pretend to give her a present, but then give it to her siblings, kind of like just another way to torture her
Right.
mentally. She finally gets her own present, and her counselor goes down, this is for you, this is for Samantha. And hearing her own name, that this is for you, was like a huge life-changing thing for her. And now she really got into camp, and she's having fun. She's excited to do everything. She loves going to the chapel. She loves going
Right.
to the swimming pool and doing all these activities. And that's where episode 5 for me is so powerful. Is just seeing how somebody who was so abused.
Well, it's like full circle.
Yeah, full circle
Because
moment.
the first 3 episodes, she's telling you about this horrific nightmare that was her childhood. And then in the second half, you're getting the response to what happens when God gets a hold of these kids through ministries like Whispering Ponies Ranch, Royal Family Kids, Teen Reach. You get a bit of closure if you follow the whole series. You get this. We didn't just volley all this terrible at you and then leave it up to your imagination to wonder whatever happened to this poor girl.
Exactly.
She now tells you the second half of the story and gets her own birthday. And
the most powerful part of Samantha's story, which gets everybody every time, is you hear how horrible she was treated, and then you see these happy moments of her at camp. But then we finish her whole story with her actually forgiving her parents. And I think at this point she's still 8 or 9 years old. She's at a church, in a kids' church service, and the pastor is talking about forgiveness, and it actually, she describes it as it gets stuck in her head of what forgiveness means. She even says in the series, I didn't know what forgiveness meant because anytime I asked for forgiveness from my parents, I was still punished. But the children's pastor is describing forgiveness, with Jesus, that it doesn't matter what you've done, he still wants to forgive you. He forgave our sins on the cross. And so this little 8-year-old girl who's gone through the
hell on earth.
Yeah, literally hell on earth, forgave her parents. And it's just like, wow, that alone, that story, I think will touch people's lives.
Oh, absolutely.
she also talks about forgiveness not being a one and done.
Right.
That this has been 20 years now plus, and she has to continuously, as she revisits a memory, just takes over her thought process, something she forgot even happened, and she has to once again
go back and
apply forgiveness to once again her biological mother or what have you. So it's a practice. Forgiveness for a lot of people, it is a practice. It's not a feeling. Like love is not a feeling all the time. It's really a verb. It's a commitment. It's an action. It's a decision that I'm going to be with my spouse regardless of whether I frustrate her. And it's a decision, right?
Yeah.
And I think forgiveness is that way.
Yes.
We've known of some friends of ours that have had to forgive very difficult to forgive things where the death of a loved one was the fault of someone else. How do you forgive that, right? And I've talked with these people, and they've asked me that. How do I forgive that? And I said, well, you probably need a smarter pastor than I am, but forgiveness isn't a feeling. If you think that you have to be able to sit there and enjoy the presence of this person and sing Kumbaya, you have the wrong idea of forgiveness. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? But forgiveness is more about you letting go of hatred and contempt because it's bad for you. Your health is affected by this. It'll steal your joy. It gets in your heart. It will manifest in disease. It'll siphon energy that God could have used, maybe in a calling. You will be blinded by doors that he's opening because you're holding on to things. That's why saying to the Lord, I choose to forgive this person, regardless of how I feel about them. I declare and I choose forgiveness for this person, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that I'm not holding on to contempt. Because, God, that's what you want for me. And then you let judgment be God's business. What God does with this person, what the quality of their life looks like, whether they succeed to work in ministry, whatever it is. And I know that nobody asked me for that, but you were talking about forgiveness, and it's been my view of forgiveness that it is like love and that it is a verb, it's a decision, it's a choice, and it's a practice. And it comes out of working with so many of these children that have asked these similar things. I can't forgive my dad for what he did because their perception of forgiveness is they have to like this person again, or be made to want to hang out with them again. I can't forgive this person. I hate him. You see what I'm saying?
And
they're holding it. You can see it. They're
forgetting what they did to you.
It doesn't mean being ignorant. It doesn't mean being naive. It doesn't mean forgetting what somebody has done as they've transgressed you and being willing to do it again. Right? And by the way, there is a flip side for anybody that cares about this. If you're the one asking for forgiveness, that is not rite of passage back into somebody's life to be able to abuse them over and over again because, hey, they won't forgive me. Why are you holding on to what we did last year? No, I'm not holding on to it. I'm doing everything I can to be free of the contempt I feel for you. I'm leaving you to God to sort out, but that does not mean you get to come back to my home. Or back around my children or whatever. So I don't know if this is helpful at all. It has very little to do directly with the series, but
Well, I think a lot of these kids, like how Samantha said, she would ask for forgiveness, in what happened with her, she got in trouble for everything she did.
Right.
You didn't do it completely correctly the way your mom wanted you to do.
Right.
And so you were punished, you were beat.
well, her mom made sure she couldn't.
Yeah, she could. There was nothing she could do that would be
She would
good
set
enough.
it up
Yeah.
and
so,
switch the rules.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these kids, growing up in the system or who have been abused, forgiveness is a tough subject to understand because unlike people who have had a regular childhood who you break your mom's vase, you might get in trouble, but they
Right.
move past it. A lot of these kids, they don't experience that. And then I think they start to view God in that way, that God isn't going to forgive me
Right.
for what I've done
Yeah.
because my mom or my dad didn't do it. That I was
Or
always
that
punished
God
no
is
matter
going to
what.
continue punishing them.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think Royal Family Kids Camp, with the kind of stories they tell at the chapel, do plant those seeds of you can forgive, you can move on,
Right.
but it has to be presented for children.
Well, and I think that's part of why, though, too, that part of the story does get so many people, too, is because she was a child that was just barely coming out of her abuse, and she is still absolutely traumatized. But for her to be able to even think about that,
Right.
I mean, it's hard as an adult to forgive people that
Exactly.
have, hurt me or one
Yeah.
of my kids or,
Yes.
things like that. So for a child that has gone through the most horrendous things that have ever happened, to say that I need to forgive, I feel like God is telling me to forgive these people. And again, yeah, she has said that it's not a one and done thing. So it
Yeah.
is, again, that process. But I think if you can get through that process, and I think that's why, though, too, it does hit so close to home for even adults, is because they are finally feeling, you know what, if she can do it, why can't I forgive? And that's because forgiveness is so hard.
And I think that's what's so unique about this series is it does speak on the real issues of sex trafficking and kids being abused. But I think even for people who haven't experienced those things, it will still touch your heart. And God works his way into everything.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, the series is meant to challenge people. I've shared many times there was a time in my life years ago where I couldn't stomach the idea of the difficult conversations around trafficking or the abuse of children. And I talked about it a little bit in Silent Cry, The Darker Side of Trafficking, the documentary that we did. And I've said that at conferences live when I've talked and shared with people, because I do want people to know I once upon a time was the guy who would hear someone else talking about it and kind of go, Lord, send that guy. I'm not wired for this. I'm not what you made me kind of too sensitive to this. I think that is a convenient way of kicking the responsibility down the road at someone else. And God kind of dealt with me about some of that. And now you guys know I live to be a child advocate. Like it's more than a host. It's more than a content creator. Like all of those other things are meaningful. And if God wants me in those battle stations, I'll stay. But it really shouldn't threaten what I care about the most, which is child advocacy, because therein I have to make determinations about what I'm going to prioritize. So I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too, where my relationship to Skywatch TV currently is that I'm hosting the flagship prophecy show. But we're also praying about the insurance dilemma that we continue to have with Whispering Ponies Ranch, and that we really need liability insurance renewed, because you go back to the archives, we're dealing with a mess with our insurance. Is not something we created. They just pulled our policy
We're not the only ones.
without any liability claims.
There are other
Because of industry, nationwide. They did this to like 10,000 other church groups
Yeah.
at the same time, so we're just a number.
Right.
But going into 2025, we've got a lot we're praying about.
Absolutely.
And we really need people to help us with this. Show it again, if you would. This series, it is not something we're permitted to share on social media.
Yeah.
If you're seeing
It's
this
being
and
squelched.
it hasn't been shadow banned or diminished or deleted, we really need you to partner with Skywatch TV to tell your friends about it. Because right now, without a grassroots movement of people doing the championing of the series for us, I mean, we are just, we are daily. Here's another text, another platform took it down or removed it. Or I've had programs respectfully decline to touch the conversation who I've done interviews with before. But on this one, they're going to pass because, respectfully, they're worried
content.
it's going to get them canceled or whatever. And so, tragically, in this country, one of the things you're not allowed to talk about is the rescue, the intervention for and of children of terrible atrocity and abuse.
Yeah.
The algorithm, whether it means to or
Right.
whether it's malevolent, and you've got demon-possessed people pulling levers, or it's just the way they've programmed the algorithms, anything that picks up on children, abuse, ministry, Jesus, that cocktail salad, gone.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It is scrubbed. It is deplatformed. It's worse than if you're trying to talk about, virus interventions in needle form that is also being, fact-checked and suppressed. And
Well,
there's just
so
certain
many things are
conversations
being-
you're not allowed to have. And
Right.
this one probably eclipses the others. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Right.
So we need you. If you want to help, and God has moved you during this podcast or wherever you're viewing this, go to skywatchtv.com. You can go to skywatchtv.com/stream right now and skip shipping. And for those that don't have a DVD player or have no interest in DVDs, watch the series right this instant.
Yeah.
skywatchtv.com/stream. But at the skywatchtvstore.com, you can also participate in a donation opportunity right now to get several items that go along with it.
Right.
They're all over the set
We
here.
all
I
have
would
a
show them
piece.
to you. Everybody's got a piece. But it's Rescued, the Samantha Story documentary. It's the Rescue Us series. It's Camp, a major motion picture starring Wayne Tesh and others that show you what happens when God gets a hold of these kids. It's Silent Cry, the darker side of trafficking, a documentary we did a couple of years ago. You get all of that for your donation of $49.99, and that includes free shipping to U.S. orders.
Yeah.
But we are so committed to arming you, our Skywatch family grassroots army
Right.
of messengers and soldiers,
Right.
that we've developed this thing called a partner pack that we're basically doing at nearly cost as a loss leader just to help arm you. It's called the Rescue Us Partner Pack.
Right.
And you'll see it at skywatchtvstore.com, but the partner pack is for your donation of $165, which includes free shipping to all U.S. orders. And it's 5 copies
Of
of
everything that
the
you
series,
see on this.
which is 6 DVDs per copy, by the way, plus all of those things I just mentioned.
Right.
And so you end up with a stack of stuff like this long. And the reason we're doing it, especially ahead of the holidays, is it's 5 copies. It's 1 for you to keep, 4 to give away.
Right.
Give them to your pastor, give them to somebody you know in law enforcement, give them to a
Yes.
child services director or
Yes.
activist that you know. Give them to people that you think are in positions of influence. Give them to grandma. Maybe
Yeah.
grandma would put it, on her calendar once a month to just pray for these kids.
Absolutely.
You don't have to have money to do something to stand in the gap
Right.
for these children, and we need
Absolutely.
your help.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And that is why it is so important to get this and even watch it. And before we have to close this episode out, though, I did want to ask one more question. And either one of you can answer this, because we've had people ask, well, is this okay to show to my kids?
Okay, yeah.
What is that conversation about? Is it going to be too gruesome? Can I even stomach it? Can my kids watch it? And I have my own thoughts about that, but I'll share that at the end. What's your take on that?
So I think every parent, you know your kids, what they can handle. If maybe your kids are too sensitive and this could be too much for them, but
Very triggering, maybe.
Yeah, if your kids have gone through something like this, probably not until they're much older watch
Sure.
something like this. But I think, we don't go into any super gruesome detail. We
Sure.
don't give examples of
Right.
sexual assault. We don't show it.
dramatize.
No.
Right.
We talk about them in more general senses, but yeah,
Sure.
we don't go into nitty-gritty detail. That would be insensitive to the victims.
Absolutely.
And this does talk about things like Epstein. And so if you know everything that goes along with that name, but again, we don't get into extreme detail. There is discussion of abortion. And so we do have a warning on the back of it, that kind of more in detail explains what kind of stuff is in here.
Sure.
But I think if you're worried about it for your kids, it would be a good idea to just watch it on your own.
Sure.
And then decide from there, maybe only show them certain episodes
Sure.
or
Yeah.
whatever. But I think I would say personally that 13 and older is probably good to watch this series because a lot of these conversations are already happening at school.
Exactly.
And this comes from a biblical standpoint of
Right.
explaining what's going on, but how, as Christians, we can deal with that kind of information.
I think that's a great idea, and that's what I would highly suggest as parents to do as well, is to go ahead and watch it yourself to see what your children might be able to handle. Our kids are a little bit different because they have watched the entirety, but we've had to have that conversation, and I think this is also a very, very good segue to communicate with your children, because it opens up that line of communication of saying, okay, this is what people are doing. You need to be aware. This is why we're so strict with your curfew, with who you're hanging out with, and things like that, because it can happen to anybody at any time, at any place. So it can be a tool that you as a parent or even as a grandparent can use as well to start those conversations with your kids or your grandkids. It needs to be talked about. This is the big taboo thing that has to be talked about. We're not going to hold punches on this, but they did do a very, very masterful job, but it's done in a way where you can still watch it and get through it and walk away saying, okay, what can I do? And that is what was so important about this to both, I think, Joe and Brittney, not want to speak for them, but of getting the message out there and giving a solution. That's the big thing. And please join us again next week here in the Simply His Coffee Shop.